very hard to go last, especially after two speeches that sort of outlined so many things that I wanted to say. I also apologize, I sent my slides a bit late, so I haven't got the integration conferences branding and logos. My birthday was Wednesday, so it's a good week for birthdays, so happy birthday to you. I think the 2 or 3 points as well, that I do represent an intermediary organization, and I think one of the key points, especially coming from Britain, that is about to leave the European Union, is that international cooperation on these issues at the civil society level is really important too. We see that the rise of racist parties, of nationalist parties in one country, clearly they're working globally, internationally. They call themselves nationalists, but they don't seem to have any problem working with each other towards exclusion. And so those of us working in civil society, regardless of whether we're part of the European Union or not, need to figure out how to work together. The second 2 points I want to make that kind of have already been made by Bob as well is that integration is for majorities, not just minorities. It's a two-way process, and we can't just be asking, what do minorities need to do to fit in better here? We need to think about how do we make the here a better place for everyone. And that will benefit not just minorities, but majorities, not just here in Estonia or in the UK, but globally in a changing world where it should be seen as a resource to be culturally aware, competent, and comfortable with the rise of Asia, with the rise of Africa, where our children will probably have to work globally, not just locally. So, you've already said who Runnymede is. I just thought I'd highlight we were founded nearly 50 years ago, so we're one of the sort of older intermediary civil society voices. I think the other thing to highlight is we call ourselves a race equality think tank, which probably doesn't make as much isn't as clear here in Estonia. Our initial publication was called Race and Immigration. And in those days, race and immigration were the same thing, because all of the sort of ethnic minorities, or most of them, were also black and people from Asia and African descent. But what our work continues to show is that generations on, even after people cease to be migrants, these challenges remain. And I think that's an important point for all of us to remember. A lot of the populations that we work to support with and that we work to learn from, 50% of the British black and minority ethnic population, 4 million people, were actually born in Britain. So it's not a question just of immigrants. And the first point I really want to make is, I think Britain is seen as a good practice example, and I think in some ways it is a good practice example, but some of the ways in which people think about Britain as a good practice example, I think are a bit confused, if not wrong. And I've spoken about this in many European settings, and one of the things that the UK is seen as strong on, and it's true, is its non-discrimination legislation. So well before the European directives, the race directive and equality legislation, the UK had race relations acts. In 1965 was the first one, 1968 and 1976. These were definitely important pieces of legislation that spoke to both minorities to say, we understand that there's discrimination in the society and we as a state are going to try to prohibit it. So it's showing the state's responsibility to minorities, but also to majority society. The law is not just about rules, it's about saying what sorts of values do we believe in as a society. So when the state passed those race relations acts, it was saying this sort of behavior is no longer acceptable. But I think that story can be told a bit too simplistically, that these sort of great legal minds came together and decided that we should pass very good laws and these will then be implemented. This would not, I don't think, the law in the first place wouldn't have happened without civil society pressure from below, nor, I don't think, with the attitudinal change that followed. And indeed, the attitudinal change on race really followed in the 1980s without an active anti-racist race equality movement, without immigrants demanding their rights, not just it being written on a piece of paper. And that's basically what integration is trying to achieve, is trying to ensure that minorities affirm the rights that they have and that majorities see that those rights are ones that all should apply to all citizens. So without the pressure from below, I don't think you would have seen the change in the law in the first place, nor, though, would you have seen the ongoing pressure and monitoring on the implementation of the law. And I'm going to say quite a bit on implementation. So I think when we look at attitudes in Britain in terms of, so there's a British social attitudes survey that looks at things like how comfortable are you with your child marrying someone of a different ethnic background. And that's changed quite remarkably since the 1980s, where 70% or 80% of the population said that people were uncomfortable, down to 30% today. So a huge change in a generation. I don't think that's happened by itself. I don't think that's happened without civil society action, but also political leadership, as more and more politicians on the right and the left in Britain are condemning racism. And I think that's actually one point that is similar with Canada as well, which is the UK, I think, is unique in having a centre-right party that's clearly and explicitly tried to appeal to ethnic minority voters and also tried to do some policy work on racism, actually. So the Prime Minister, Theresa May, has launched the race disparity audit to outline all of the inequalities that exist in Britain, and she's now committing to trying to reduce those through policy. So that's not something that you can imagine centre-right governments elsewhere in Europe doing. There's a famous quote from the Home Secretary in 1966, who our founder was, the founder of Runnymede was his special advisor. But he described integration not as a flattening process of assimilation, but as equal opportunity accompanied by cultural diversity and an atmosphere of mutual tolerance. So that's kind of, I think, still a good definition 50 years on. I think the previous discussion with politicians, but also early in the day, and also indeed in Britain, shows there is still a question, I think, of who should integrate. I mean, even your presentation talked about cultural, linguistic, ethnic groups, and obviously these are different kinds of groups. There may be national minorities that have existed for years, or there may be new migrants, or there may be refugees. So I do think we do need to think about that when we're designing integration policy and not assume that all the same policies will work for all those groups. So just because we've had a very effective policy, for example, in dealing with a national minority, doesn't mean that that same exact policy can just be transferred and that will be all right. I think the acrobat metaphor going on is a good one. So I think most prominently people have in mind race and ethnicity, cultural difference, or religion. Obviously, with the refugee crisis, immigrants and refugees are fitting into that and overlap with the first one. Clearly, part of the concern around the refugees is that they come from Syria, that they come from Eritrea. These are countries and cultures that a lot of Europeans don't think are Western or belong in this continent, unfortunately. But I think in the UK anyway, and more widely, we heard it a bit on social class, I think, in terms of neighborhoods here in Tallinn. There's also a question of integration across class, across age. In fact, there was a commission on social integration in Britain, and it found that division across ages was actually one of the biggest divisions. The likelihood of young people knowing older people who were not their grandparents was actually very low. So older people and younger people were not interacting. It's for all of us, as I said before. But the point that I want to raise is it's not just a question of how we conceptualize it, it's then a question of how we measure it. And there are different ways of measuring it, whether we're talking about geographic, socioeconomic, participation, political, cultural, or interpersonal. How do people, how many people, for example, have friendships from another ethnic group? So I think, again, we need to sort of think about these different domains and how then, depending on which of those domains you're interested in, what do you want to measure and how are we going to measure it? Before I say what's the role of civil society, I do want to say what is the role of government. And I think one of the roles of civil society is, in fact, holding government to account on what the role of government is and not trying to do the things that government should do. So, for example, I was recently asked, should we help to try to increase voter registration? Fine, I'm happy to try to do that, but it's the state's obligation to ensure that those who have an entitlement to vote are voting. And I think it's a use of civil society action for us to be necessarily registering people to vote. We will do it if the state fails its duties, but that's a failed state duty. So the government has a strong role across society, but especially not simply to give these rights because it's like nice to do or part of justice, it's actually to ensure its legitimacy. If the state isn't providing rights to a certain part of the citizenry, those citizens who cannot vote have no reason to see that state as legitimate. That state is refusing its obligations. It's refusing its side of the social contract. And I think that's one of the reasons sometimes you can see the danger of conflict and violence that we've heard the previous two speakers talk about. I think that includes, in the first part, legislation, so strong non-discriminational legislation, commitment to equal opportunities, but also policies in housing, education, health, and employment. Those are areas, again, where it's not just civil society's role to enact projects on the ground, it's government's role to ensure that those domains, those policy areas have equal opportunities for all to participate and benefit from them. We particularly feel that enforcing non-discriminating in the labor market is particularly important. The labor market is arguably the most important domain of integration. You've got people not only working so that they're actually contributing and feel the self-confidence, but also they're often working collaboratively in teams towards common ends. And usually you can't choose your coworkers. So you have to work with people who you may not even like, you may disagree with, who may not be the same background as you. So the labor market is important both for the individual confidence and income that it provides, and of course then for the next generation to ensure that the children see that their parents have equal opportunities. I mean, one of the things I think that does happen around dinner tables still today in Britain is that black families sometimes do have to tell their children that you may not get a fair chance in the labor market because I haven't had this experience. And that's sad that we still have to see those conversations happening. But arguably that's good practice from a parent trying to shield their child from the limitations of equal opportunities in the labor market. But it's why the labor market, I think, is so important. Language, we've heard a lot about here in Estonia. I'm not going to say too much about it because it's clearly a controversial area, but I think we should view it a little bit less culturally always, basically. It is actually a utilitarian question as well. How are you going to access services if you can't speak the services of the institutions? And if the state isn't providing such access, obviously language is bound up in culture, tradition, and music, etc., and history. But it's also a practical device for transmitting knowledge and for accessing services. And I think that some of these debates might become a little bit less strident if in Estonia and elsewhere it was seen in that way. In general, in fact, we feel there's too much focus on cultural difference or cultural practices. And in fact, as you saw, Runnymede, we call ourselves a race equality organization. And I want to reflect a little bit on why it might be even easier to do this kind of work in Britain, which is that while there are 8 million ethnic minorities and 10 million migrants, no single group is more than a quarter of that population. So we have a lot of different populations, which means that the groups have to come together in order to work together towards common platforms. So, you know, we have Asian groups and black groups, Muslim groups, Hindu groups. I'm not saying it always works perfectly, but for example, in London, there are wards, which is a population of, say, 5,000 people, where no single population is more than 14%. So you have one group that's 14%, one group that's 12%, one group that's 11%. That makes it very hard for an entrepreneurial, conflict-driven politician to take advantage because there's so many different groups. In Estonia, and I would argue maybe also in Oldham, in northern England, you have two populations, and that is a bigger challenge, I think. So I would say that there is a sort of interesting demographic challenge where you have two populations who are relatively high in population. Obviously, when one group is 5% and another is 95%, this doesn't hold. But where one minority is, say, 20% and another is 80%, as it is here, but as I understand things, but also is the case in some of the northern towns where you have a white English majority and a Pakistani minority. There tends to be more conflict in those areas than where you have multiple ethnic groups. And I think one of the reasons is then the focus on cultural practice is sort of highlighted because there's just two groups whose differences are otherwise not as great as people might think. But what is the role of civil society? So I've got some things I think civil society should do. So first is to support and campaign to ensure government fulfills its obligations. I think I've said enough about that already. Secondly, maybe to help think about the different kinds of solutions that those might mean. So I think there are universal services. So I think the National Health Service in Britain is probably one of the greatest equalizers of opportunities and outcomes across race because ethnic minorities are more likely to have ill health. But I think just saying that universal services provide universal benefits is not good enough. We need to monitor and evaluate whether that is in fact the case. And sometimes that may mean that you need to tweak those services so that you get civil society organizations supporting outreach and delivery work. So for example, in the UK, we found that Asians were less likely to give organs. And so there were sort of targeted advertising at Asian communities. And I think this was a way to increase organ donation, not simply because we wanted Asians to give more organs, but because there was a need in the population because of the way in which you need a DNA match you need matches for organs. So I think that's still a universal service. We're still looking at providing organ donation, but we're just trying to stimulate the demand. So this may also involve, though, further more targeted provision, the delivery of, say, labor market activation programs or language provision, which obviously target only specific groups. Here, I think civil society organizations are often better placed to play a role. So we have employment offices in local areas, but they don't always do an excellent job of reaching out to those communities. So they might need to partner a sort of local employment office, which is a state function, partners with a local employment service support group that knows the local ethnic minority or local population better and then delivers better outcomes in the labor market. Similarly, on language provision, I think it's not just the state's role, but potentially civil society. The final point I'm going to make before I conclude is this second to last one here, because I'm realizing I'm running out of time. I think this is a really important question, and it's one that Bob picked up, which is we should be demanding in civil society that the policy is underpinned by evidence, that we don't just have politicians sort of saying they're doing things or having debates. We want to make sure that what they're saying they're going to do is being evaluated and the data is being collected. And so I think that civil society needs to argue for better data collection. And one of the reasons is, and that this should also feed into a better narrative on what kind of society we are and how we're doing. There's this narrative in Britain that residential segregation is really bad and that it's increasing, whereas in fact, if you look at the data, integration is increasing in most local authorities and for all ethnic minority groups in Britain. Minorities are becoming more dispersed, and in Britain today, if you're a white person, you're more likely to meet or know a black or Asian person than any point in the past. And this is actually true in most European societies, despite the sort of alarmist fears around segregation. So this is one of the examples as to why we need data. We can rebut silly, unevidenced, alarmist claims about segregation. The group that's the most segregated in Britain is the white British population, and that is true in most countries because of the nature of ethnic minority. Very few ethnic minority groups are 50% of a population in a local area, unlike the United States. I think this is the other thing. People hear the word segregation and they think it's similar as in the US. In the United States, you have cities that are 1 million people where 90% plus are of one non-white group. In Britain, you have to go down to the level of 10,000 people where you even get 50% of one group. So 100 times smaller areas of geography, half as many of the people of that ethnic minority group. That is not segregated on the sort of US level. I just wanted to say on this area, it's kind of an area that's interesting that people think about. How would you make people move together? And I think it's one that we have to be very cautious about. I think requiring individuals to choose their neighbors is a bit it brings out a bit of the libertarian in me. People should be able to make choices about where they live. What the state can do, and what civil society should be arguing for, is that housing policies don't worsen segregation, that you don't allocate housing purely on the basis of local connection or ethnicity. And I think the other thing, make schools equally good wherever they are. That will encourage middle-class white populations not to leave areas that have too many ethnic minorities. So this is just to show you what you can do with data. I'm going to run through these slides. The point of these slides is not to look at them carefully, it's just to make 2 points. One, there's still a lot of ethnic disadvantage in Britain. 2, data is useful. So hopefully pick up those 2 points and go with them. So you can just see, I have no shortages. I have many, many slides of that sort. The key point, though, that I want to raise on terms of what should we respond to is the problem that areas are diverse, or is the problem that areas are deprived? And after you adjust for how deprived an area is, how poor an area is, how badly otherwise economic conditions and opportunities are in an area, ethnic diversity in Britain is actually associated with higher social cohesion and greater feelings that people in the area get along well. I think we talked a little bit about local areas, but actually people feel quite proud of their local areas. And there's no barrier to that feeling of pride in a local area just because an area is diverse. Conversely, if an area is deprived, so if there's bad economic conditions and poor opportunities and poor schooling, that does have low social cohesion. So an area where people don't feel like you have much opportunities is unfortunately also an area where people feel like they don't get along well with one another. So if we're looking to get people to get along well with each other, we should worry less about segregation or on a geographic spatial level and more about combating economic disadvantage. So what should be done? I said framing. So as I said, one of the reasons I'm in favor of framing, I've only got a minute left here, is because one of the reasons I'm keen on measurement is it helps with the framing. It helps us understand what the issue is. And I won't say much more about it, but I just think that one of the things it gets us to do is not lump in all ethnic minorities together, which I think is a good thing to do. It measures what the majority is doing, not just the minority. And it allows us to be cautious about assuming segregation or too strong cultural difference. Our focus, and this I think is my last slide, is on inequalities, especially in the labor market. We think that links those geographic issues about where people live with the relevant outcomes, whether where they live gives them opportunity to get jobs and good education. People need to feel, and I think this speaks to the previous panel's discussion, that they're interacting as peers. I sometimes hear policymakers say, well, why don't black people invite white people over to my house for a cup of tea or vice versa? If people are being demanded that you interact with them and they don't feel like the other group sees you as an equal, it's unsurprising that they don't want to mix with you. So in order to facilitate proper equal interaction, the people interacting need to feel like it's a balanced interaction, that they are peers in that interaction, not that one has more power than the other. And I think the final question that I've sort of come back to is, what is the role then of government and of civil society? These are the various things that you might want to do something in. I thought I'd just raise it that, some of those spaces, the government has a role, some of those places, civil society has a role, and I've sort of outlined where I think each part, whether it's an intermediary institution or civil society or the state, or indeed other organizations, should play a role. Thanks.